March 1943. Over the skies of occupied Europe, Lieutenant Jack Wilson pushed his P-47 Thunderbolt into a shallow dive, watching German freight trains snake through the French countryside below. His orders were clear: escort the bombers, engage enemy fighters, return to base. The 850 caliber machine guns mounted in his wings could shred a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but those trains, those supply convoys, those ammunition dumps, sitting fat and vulnerable on the ground, they were off limits. Not because attacking them was strategically unwise, not because the P-47 couldn't do the job, but because physics and paperwork said the Thunderbolt was a fighter, not a bomber. And in March 1943, if you wanted to hang bombs under your wings, physics had something very specific to say about it. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons empty, making it the heaviest single-engine fighter in the world. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Its designers at Republic Aviation had built it around one principle: high-altitude interception. The massive Pratt & Whitney Ardwa 1800 double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders generating 2,000 horsepower, pushed the aircraft to altitudes where German bombers couldn't hide and fighters couldn't breathe. At 35,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was king. On the ground, it was a different story. The engineering challenge started with that enormous radial engine. To give the propeller clearance, Republic's chief designer Alexander Kartveli had to develop telescopic landing gear that extended 9 inches longer than when retracted. The weight distribution was calculated down to the pound. Add too much weight, too far forward or aft, and the aircraft became uncontrollable. Add weight asymmetrically under the wings, and you risked catastrophic roll characteristics during takeoff. The P-47B and early C models that arrived in Britain in late 1942 came with a single hardpoint under the fuselage centerline. Engineers had stressed it to carry one 500-pound bomb or a 75-gallon drop tank. That was it. The wings had no provisions for external stores. The structure wasn't reinforced. The control surfaces weren't calibrated for asymmetric loading. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional design philosophy. The Army Air Forces in 1941 believed in specialized aircraft. Fighters fought, bombers bombed. You didn't ask a thoroughbred racehorse to pull a plow. The P-47's mission was to climb high, fly fast, shoot down German fighters and come home. Period. But by spring of 1943, the war wasn't cooperating with pre-war assumptions. 8th Air Force bomber crews were dying in horrific numbers over Germany. The escort fighters could only go so far before fuel ran out, forcing them to turn back and leave the bombers naked to Luftwaffe attacks. Every gallon of fuel carried meant another mile of protection, another minute of coverage, another bomber that might make it home. The solution was obvious: hang drop tanks under the wings to extend range. The problem was equally obvious: the P-47's wings weren't designed for it. Republic Aviation's engineers ran the calculations. Adding hard points under the wings meant reinforcing the wing structure to handle the loads. It meant redesigning the attachment points. It meant extensive testing to verify the modifications wouldn't compromise structural integrity during high-G maneuvers. It meant months of development and approval processes. The Army Air Forces didn't have months. They needed extended range immediately. In July 1943, the first P-47s flew escort missions with belly-mounted drop tanks. The results were encouraging. Thunderbolts could now shepherd bombers deeper into enemy territory. But the belly tank occupied the only available hardpoint. If you wanted to carry fuel, you couldn't carry bombs. And increasingly, commanders were asking, why not both? The question wasn't just academic. By late 1943, Allied planners were preparing for D-Day. The invasion would require massive tactical air support, fighter bombers that could strafe enemy positions, destroy bridges, interdict supply lines. The P-47, with its ability to absorb punishment and its devastating firepower, seemed perfect for the role. Except it could only carry one 500-pound bomb at a time. German and Japanese fighters routinely carried bombs under their wings. The British Hawker Typhoon could haul 2,000 pounds of ordnance. Even American light bombers carried less payload per sortie than what tactical commanders wanted from their fighters. The P-47, for all its strengths, was capacity limited by its original design parameters. Republic Aviation's engineering team knew this. They'd been working on solutions since early 1943. The challenge wasn't just mounting the racks, it was ensuring the modifications didn't kill pilots. An improperly designed pylon could create turbulence that interfered with aileron authority. Asymmetric loading during a bombing run could induce uncontrollable rolls. Release malfunctions could send a 1,000-pound bomb into your propeller arc. The engineers at Republic's Farmingdale, New York facility started with the D-15 production variant. They reinforced the wing structure at 2 points outboard of the landing gear, adding internal support members to distribute loads. They designed a standardized pylon that could accept either a bomb or a drop tank. The system was elegant in its simplicity: 3 attach points, a mechanical release, and aerodynamic fairings to minimize drag. Testing began in late 1943. Test pilots flew the modified Thunderbolts through increasingly aggressive maneuvers. 8G turns with tanks attached, dive bombing runs at terminal velocity, asymmetric configurations with a bomb under one wing and a tank under the other. The modifications held, the aircraft remained uncontrollable. In January 1944, the Army Air Forces approved the underwing pylons for production. But approval from Wright Field didn't mean immediate deployment. The modifications required more than just new hardware. Every P-47C and early D model already in service would need retrofit kits installed. Maintenance crews would need training on the new systems. Pilots would need to learn different flight characteristics. And most critically, the pylons themselves needed to be manufactured and shipped to every theatre where Thunderbolts operated. The bottleneck was mundane but critical: man-hours. Installing underwing pylons on earlier P-47 variants wasn't complicated, but it wasn't quick either. Removing inspection panels, drilling precise mounting holes through load-bearing structure, installing reinforcement plates, calibrating release mechanisms, each aircraft required between 150 and 200 hours of work by trained mechanics. In England, maintenance officers did the math. The 8th Air Force had hundreds of P-47s. Each fighter group had ground crews stretched thin, keeping aircraft flyable after combat damage. Taking birds offline for a week of modifications meant fewer aircraft available for missions, but commanders wanted that capability immediately. The solution came from an unexpected direction: field expedients and authorized shortcuts. Republic Aviation sent technical teams to England with pre-manufactured pylon kits and detailed installation procedures, but they also quietly authorized maintenance crews to use simplified installation methods that cut the work time by nearly half. Reinforce the critical load points, install the pylons, test the releases, get the aircraft back in rotation. Was it perfect engineering? No. Did it follow every peacetime regulation about aircraft modifications? Absolutely not. Did it work? Combat results would provide the answer. Modified with underwing pylons. The 9th Air Force, preparing for tactical operations over France, received priority for factory-fresh P-47 D-15s and later variants that came with the pylons already installed. The first combat test came during the weeks leading up to D-Day. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force ranged across northern France, attacking bridges, rail yards, and German defensive positions. Thunderbolts carrying 2 500-pound bombs under the wings and another 500-pounder on the belly centerline delivered 1,500 pounds per sortie. Later, variants with strengthened wings could carry 2,000-pound bombs underwing and a 500-pounder centerline, £2,500 total. £2,500. That was more than many light bombers could carry. And the P-47 could deliver it while defending itself with 8 machine guns, then fight its way home through enemy interceptors. The transformation was remarkable. An aircraft designed purely for high-altitude air superiority had become one of the war's most effective ground attack platforms. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd been paying attention. In 1941, Army Air Forces doctrine insisted that fighters and bombers were separate animals requiring separate designs. By 1944, the most successful American fighter in Europe was spending most of its time dropping bombs on bridges and strafing truck convoys. The Thunderbolt hadn't changed. The war had, but there was a cost. Every modification has consequences. The underwing pylons, even the streamlined later designs, created drag that reduced the P-47's maximum speed by 15 miles per hour. That might not sound like much, but in combat against Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190As, 15 miles per hour could mean the difference between catching an enemy or watching him escape. It could mean outdiving an opponent or taking cannon fire in the engine. The weight was equally problematic. A P-47 loaded with 2,500 pounds of bombs and full internal fuel weighed over 9 tons at takeoff. The landing gear, already stressed by the aircraft's inherent mass, absorbed punishing loads. Tire failures increased, hydraulic systems strained. Pilots reported handling characteristics that bordered on sluggish during the critical moments after takeoff, when engine failure meant no room for error. And then there were the dive bombing problems that nobody had anticipated. The P-47 was fast. In a dive, it could exceed 450 miles per hour, pushing the edges of compressibility where aerodynamic forces become unpredictable. With the additional weight of bombs and fuel, Thunderbolts in steep attack dives were building up even higher speeds. During recovery, pulling out of the dive and climbing back to altitude, pilots were pulling 6, 7, 8 Gs. At those G-forces, strange things happened. Fuel systems experienced vapor lock as acceleration forced fuel away from engine intakes. The massive A2800 engine, starved momentarily of fuel, coughed and stumbled. Some pilots reported complete engine failures during high G pullouts. Investigation teams traced the problem back to the underwing loads. The extra weight allowed faster dives, which meant harder recoveries, which meant fuel surge that the original fuel system design hadn't anticipated. Republic engineers developed a solution: dive recovery flaps, electrically operated panels on the wing, undersurfaces that could be extended during dive recovery to slow the aircraft and reduce G-loading. The modification worked, but it was another system to install, another component to maintain, another potential failure point. The P-47 D30 and later variants included dive recovery flaps as standard equipment. This cascade of modifications, underwing pylons leading to dive recovery flaps, leading to improved fuel systems, illustrated a fundamental truth about engineering. You can't change one thing without affecting everything else. The P-47 that emerged by mid-1944 was a different aircraft than the one that had entered service in 1943. Same airframe, same engine, same basic design, but the mission had evolved, and the aircraft evolved with it. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history. Above the beaches of Normandy, above the hedgerows of the French countryside, Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force provided a steel umbrella of protection and destruction. They hit German strongpoints with bombs and rockets. They strafed enemy columns trying to reinforce the beaches. They escorted transport aircraft dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines. In a single day, P-47 pilots flew more than 3,000 sorties. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs, they fired millions of rounds of ammunition, and they did it while maintaining air superiority over the invasion force, ensuring that Luftwaffe bombers and fighters couldn't interfere with the landings. The Thunderbolt's transformation from pure fighter to fighter bomber proved its worth in blood and steel. The statistics from D-Day until VE Day in May 1945 are staggering. Thunderbolt pilots claimed destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Some of these claims were surely inflated. Combat reporting always is. But even accounting for overclaiming, the numbers represent a catastrophic level of destruction inflicted on German logistics and mobility. One operation in particular demonstrated the P-47's effectiveness. On July 29, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, the 405 fighter group caught a German armoured column trapped between Roncy and Saint-Denis-le-Vetou for 6.5 hours, from 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 at 25 night. Thunderbolts worked over the column with bombs and machine gun fire. Ground investigations after the battle found 66 tanks destroyed, 204 vehicles wrecked, and 11 artillery pieces demolished. In a single afternoon, one fighter group had effectively annihilated an entire German combat formation. That level of destruction required aircraft that could carry meaningful bomb loads while remaining survivable in the face of ground fire. The P-47, with its armoured cockpit, redundant systems, and the massive radial engine that could absorb punishment and keep running, was uniquely suited for the mission. But it's worth asking, who deserves credit for that success? The pilots who flew the missions certainly earned their place in history. The ground crews who kept the aircraft flying under impossible conditions deserve recognition. The tactical commanders who developed the close air support doctrines played their part. But what about the engineers who designed those underwing pylons? What about the maintenance crews who installed them? What about the test pilots who verified the modifications wouldn't kill operational pilots? Their names don't appear in after-action reports. There are no medals for the mechanic who spent 200 hours retrofitting a P-47C with underwing racks. No citations for the Republic aviation engineer who calculated wing loading factors and stress distributions. They did their jobs, solved their problems, and moved on to the next challenge. The nature of their contribution was too technical, too mundane, too far from the drama of combat to capture popular imagination. Yet without them, the Thunderbolt remains a pure fighter. Without those pylons, D-Day looks different. Maybe the invasion still succeeds. The Allies had overwhelming force and determination. But German counterattacks hit harder. Supply convoys reach the front more intact. The breakout from Normandy takes longer, costs more casualties. The cumulative effect of thousands of fighter-bomber sorties that didn't happen would ripple across the campaign. This is the hidden history of warfare. Logistics and engineering mattering as much as courage and tactics. The P-47's transformation from interceptor to ground attack aircraft required no brilliant maverick mechanic defying regulations. It required institutional adaptation, designers recognizing changing requirements, engineers solving technical problems, commanders accepting that pre-war doctrine needed updating, maintenance crews working long hours to implement modifications. The story is less dramatic than one stubborn innovator proving everyone wrong, but it's more representative of how military adaptation actually happens. Successful militaries learn. They iterate. They take an aircraft designed for one mission and modify it for another when circumstances demand. They accept that perfect is the enemy of good enough, and good enough today beats perfect next month. By 1945, the P-47 had become the Army Air Force's primary fighter bomber in Europe. More Thunderbolts flew operational sorties than P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings combined. The Mustang, lighter and longer-ranged, took over strategic escort duties. The Lightning served in the Mediterranean and Pacific, but for the grinding work of interdiction and close air support, commanders wanted Thunderbolts. The Pacific Theater told a similar story. When P-47s arrived in the Southwest Pacific in mid-1943, they initially served as high-altitude interceptors. Japanese fighters operated at lower altitudes, where the Thunderbolts' weight and size were disadvantages. But as the campaign progressed and American forces island-hopped toward Japan, the need shifted toward ground attack. P-47s with underwing bombs became the preferred aircraft for hitting Japanese bunkers, supply dumps, and shipping. The final variant, the P-47N, was designed specifically for Pacific operations. Longer wings, additional fuel capacity, and strengthened pylons that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs plus 10 rockets. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Range increased to nearly 2,000 miles with external tanks. These aircraft arrived too late to see extensive combat before Japan's surrender, but they represented the logical endpoint of the Thunderbolt's evolution from interceptor to multi-role strike fighter. After the war, surplus P-47s served with air forces around the world. France, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, Colombia, dozens of nations operated Thunderbolts well into the 1950s. Almost universally, they used them as fighter bombers rather than pure fighters. The underwing pylons that had been a battlefield modification in 1943 became standard equipment that defined the aircraft's post-war role. Modern air forces take multi-role capability for granted. An F-16 or F-18 carries air-to-air missiles for fighter missions and precision-guided bombs for ground attack. The same aircraft, the same pilot, switches between roles depending on the mission. That flexibility traces its lineage back to World War II adaptations, like the P-47's transformation. The concept that a fighter could also be a bomber wasn't obvious in 1941. By 1945, it was doctrine. The men who flew Thunderbolts in combat tell remarkably consistent stories. The aircraft was huge, heavy, and intimidating to new pilots. It climbed slowly, turned poorly at low altitude, and guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. But it was also nearly indestructible. Pilots brought P-47s home with engine cylinders shot away, control surfaces shredded, and holes you could put your fist through. The radial engine kept running, the redundant control systems kept responding. Those characteristics made the Thunderbolt ideal for low-altitude ground attack where anti-aircraft fire was concentrated and vicious. German flak gunners learned to respect P-47s. You could hit them, but hitting them didn't necessarily mean killing them. Pilots exploited that survivability, pressing attacks closer than they might have in more fragile aircraft. The combination of survivability and payload made the P-47 devastatingly effective in the role nobody had originally envisioned for it. There's a lesson here about innovation and adaptation. Not every advance comes from someone breaking rules. Sometimes progress comes from institutions recognizing that circumstances have changed and responding appropriately. The Army Air Forces in 1941 designed the P-47 for one mission. The Army Air Forces in 1944 needed something different. Instead of insisting reality conform to pre-war planning, they adapted. That adaptation required multiple groups working in concert. Republic aviation engineers designed the modifications. Army Air Forces test pilots validated them. Maintenance crews installed them. Combat pilots employed them. Commanders integrated them into operational doctrine. No single person drove the change. It was collaborative, institutional, and ultimately successful, precisely because multiple stakeholders recognized the necessity and worked toward implementation. The alternative would have been rigidity, insisting that fighters fight and bombers bomb, regardless of operational requirements. Maintaining doctrinal purity at the cost of tactical effectiveness. History is full of militaries that failed to adapt, that clung to outdated concepts until reality forced change through catastrophic losses. The American experience with the P-47 represents the opposite, recognition that adaptation beats perfection. By late 1944, P-47 pilots were dropping napalm on Japanese positions in the Pacific. Napalm yellowed gasoline in drop tanks that ignited on impact, creating firestorms that cleared bunkers and fortifications. Nobody in 1941 imagined Thunderbolts carrying flaming death to enemy infantry. But the war demanded it, the aircraft could do it, and pilots used it to devastating effect. The mission evolved, the aircraft evolved with it. The final accounting is cold but informative. 15,683 P-47s were manufactured between 1941 and 1945, more than any other American fighter. They flew over 700,000 combat sorties across all theaters. They were lost at a rate of 0.7% per mission, extraordinarily low for the intensity of combat they experienced. Pilots achieved an air-to-air kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 against enemy aircraft. But the statistics that matter most are the ones never recorded. The German tank that didn't reach the front because a Thunderbolt destroyed it on a French road. The supply convoy that never delivered ammunition because P-47s interdicted the rail line. The Japanese bunker that couldn't hold because napalm burned out the defenders. These uncounted contributions accumulated across thousands of sorties into strategic impact that shaped the war's outcome. The men who designed those underwing pylons never received medals. The mechanics who installed them worked in obscurity. The test pilots who validated the modifications moved on to other projects. Their contribution was technical, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. Without their work, the Thunderbolt remains forever an interceptor, watching ground targets pass beneath while carrying insufficient ordnance to matter. Instead, the P-47 became a war winner, not through any single brilliant innovation, but through steady professional adaptation to changing requirements. Sometimes that's how history happens, not with revolutionary breakthroughs, but with competent people solving problems and implementing solutions. The Thunderbolt that helped win World War II was a different machine than the Thunderbolt that entered service. Same airframe, different mission, successful adaptation. The question of credit extends beyond engineering to doctrine. American military culture in 1943 retained considerable institutional flexibility compared to more rigid command structures. When field experience suggested modifications to established practices, the system could adapt relatively quickly. The P-47's transformation from pure fighter to multi-role platform happened because multiple levels of command recognized necessity and enabled change. Compare this to other militaries that lacked similar flexibility. German doctrine in World War II often suffered from rigid adherence to pre-war planning, even when circumstances demanded adaptation. Japanese military culture struggled with bottom-up innovation, preferring top-down directives that couldn't always account for battlefield realities. The Soviet system could impose massive changes through sheer authority, but often at catastrophic cost in lives and material. The American approach wasn't perfect. Bureaucracy still slowed some innovations. Inter-service rivalry sometimes prevented optimal resource allocation. But the P-47 story demonstrates a system that could recognize changed requirements, authorize modifications, implement solutions, and validate results through combat experience, all within a timeframe, measured in months rather than years. This adaptability extended to tactics as well as technology. In March 1944, Major Glenn Duncan of the 353 Fighter Group pioneered low-level strafing techniques with the P-47. Duncan was the archetype of the aggressive fighter pilot, rangy Texan, natural leader, willing to take calculated risks. He convinced commanders to authorize operational evaluation of the Thunderbolt as a fast, low-altitude ground attack platform. Duncan's innovation wasn't technological, it was tactical. He recognized that the P-47's diving speed, its ability to drop like a falling safe, could be weaponized for ground attack. Come in high and fast, dive on the target, release ordnance or strafe, then use retained speed to escape before anti-aircraft gunners could track effectively. The technique required nerve and precision, but it worked. His squadron mates watched Duncan demonstrate the approach and adopted it themselves. Other groups observed the results and requested similar training. By D-Day, low-level strafing had become standard doctrine for P-47 units assigned to tactical air support. One pilot's innovation propagated across the entire force structure within weeks. That's organizational learning functioning as designed. The pilot perspective on this transformation is worth considering. Men who joined fighter squadrons in 1942 expected to engage enemy aircraft in aerial combat. They trained for dogfighting the romantic image of fighter pilot as aerial knight. By 1944, those same pilots were spending most missions attacking ground targets, flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, where one unlucky hit could kill you instantly. Some resented the change. Air-to-air combat, for all its danger, offered agency. Your survival depended on skill, situational awareness, and split-second decision-making. Ground attack meant flying through curtains of flak, where skill mattered less than luck. A random 20mm shell could shred your aircraft, regardless of how good a pilot you were. The psychological shift from hunter to target was difficult for some to accept. But the men adapted because the mission required it. Lieutenant Ray Walsh, flying with the P-47 fighter bomber group, nearly died on June 23, 1944, when he destroyed an ammunition truck. The resulting explosion almost caught his P-47 in the blast radius. He survived, adjusted his tactics, and continued flying ground attack missions. The professionalism of accepting dangerous work because the war demanded it defined that generation of combat pilots. The danger was real and measurable. Fighter bombers attacking ground targets faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from every German unit with functioning weapons. A P-47 flying at low altitude presented an easy target for even mediocre gunners. The aircraft's ruggedness saved many pilots, but losses accumulated. From D-Day through the end of the war in Europe, the Army Air Forces lost 3,499 P-47 to all causes in combat. Each loss represented a pilot killed, captured, or grievously wounded. Yet the losses were proportionally lower than other aircraft types flying similar missions. The P-47's 0.7% loss rate per mission was extraordinarily low given the intensity of combat operations. That survival rate validates the original design philosophy: build them tough, armor the critical components, give the pilot protection. When you're flying through flak, rugged construction saves lives. The aftermath of specific attacks illustrates the Thunderbolt's impact. On August 28, 1944, Captain William Colgan led 3 P-47s up the Rhône River Valley in southern France. They discovered a German column 30 miles long, thousands of vehicles retreating north, away from the Allied invasion of southern France. The column stretched as far as Colgan could see, vehicles packed 2 and 3 abreast in places. 3 aircraft against an entire army division. The odds seem absurd, but Colgan attacked anyway, and the effect was devastating. The first pass scattered the column. Drivers abandoned vehicles. Troops dove for cover. The concentrated firepower of 3 P-47's 24 machine guns, firing simultaneously shredded trucks and half-track. Bombs cratered the road. The entire column ground to a halt, paralyzed by air power. More Thunderbolts arrived as word spread. The attack continued for hours. By nightfall, hundreds of German vehicles sat burning or abandoned along the highway. The division that had started the day as a formed military unit ended it as scattered remnants hiding in ditches and forests. Air power had achieved what ground forces would have needed days of combat to accomplish. Stories like Colgan's attack multiplied across every theatre. In Italy, P-47s from the 12th Air Force flew Operation Strangle, systematically destroying German supply lines. In Burma, Royal Air Force squadrons equipped with Thunderbolts provided close air support for British and Commonwealth ground forces fighting Japanese infantry. In the Philippines, the Mexican 21st Fighter Squadron flying P-47s as part of the 5th Air Force attacked Japanese positions with a loss rate of 0. 791 sorties without a single aircraft or pilot lost to enemy action. The Brazilian experience deserves particular mention. The Primeiro Grupo de Caça da Força Aérea Brasileira, the Brazilian Air Force's 11th Fighter Squadron, flew 48 P-47s in combat over northern Italy and Central Europe from November 1944 through May 1945. They flew 445 missions, losing 15 aircraft to German flak and 5 pilots killed in action. In the early 1980s, the American government awarded the unit a Presidential Unit Citation for their wartime achievements. Brazilian pilots faced the same dangers as their American counterparts, but operated with less extensive support infrastructure. Their maintenance crews worked with limited spare parts, their supply lines stretched across the Atlantic. Yet they maintained operational effectiveness throughout the Italian campaign, demonstrating that the P-47's basic ruggedness compensated for logistical challenges. You could keep Thunderbolts flying even when everything else was breaking down. The Pacific theater presented different challenges but similar solutions. Japanese forces in the Philippines, New Guinea, and the island chains approaching Japan relied heavily on dispersed supply dumps, hidden air bases, and camouflaged positions. Finding targets required extensive reconnaissance. Destroying them required accurate delivery of ordnance. The P-47 variant, with its extended range and heavy payload capacity, excelled at both missions. P-47 pilots described missions that lasted 6 or 7 hours, flying over vast expanses of ocean to hit targets on distant islands, then returning to base with fuel gauges reading nearly empty. The extended-range fuel tanks that made such missions possible also made the aircraft vulnerable. A P-47 loaded with fuel was essentially a flying bomb. One incendiary round in the wrong place and you became a fireball. Pilots accepted the risk because the mission required reaching targets that no other aircraft could hit. The contrast between theaters is instructive. European operations emphasized tactical air support for ground forces. Pacific operations focused more on interdiction and strategic bombing of infrastructure. The same basic aircraft performed both missions effectively because the underlying design was sound and the modifications enabled flexibility. This multi-role capability presaged post-war fighter development in ways that wouldn't become apparent for decades. German commanders certainly recognized the Thunderbolt's impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, told his captors after the war that Allied air power had made it impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. The statement was hyperbole. Some trains got through, but the exasperation was real. German logistics had been systematically dismantled by fighter bombers, and Thunderbolts constituted a large percentage of the aircraft doing the dismantling. Luftwaffe pilots developed healthy respect for P-47s. Ace Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 aerial victories, said the Thunderbolt could absorb an astounding amount of lead and had to be handled very carefully. Baer meant that shooting down a P-47 required either a killing shot on pilot or sustained fire that overwhelmed the aircraft's structural strength. Glancing hits that would cripple other fighters often left Thunderbolts flyable. This reputation for toughness created psychological effects beyond mere survival statistics. German pilots knew that attacking a formation of P-47s meant risking concentrated return fire from aircraft that wouldn't go down easily. The calculus of aerial combat shifted when your opponent could absorb punishment and keep fighting. Some Luftwaffe pilots chose to avoid engagement rather than risk combat with Thunderbolts, which was exactly the kind of deterrent effect that air superiority was supposed to create. The final months of the war in Europe saw P-47s operating from forward airfields in France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself. Ground crews worked in muddy fields with minimal equipment, keeping aircraft flyable through determination and improvisation. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day during critical operations. The pace of operations was unsustainable long-term, but it didn't need to be sustainable long-term. It just needed to last until Germany collapsed, and it did. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. P-47 squadrons stood down from combat operations. Pilots who'd flown hundreds of missions could finally stop scanning the sky for enemy fighters and the ground for flak bursts. The Thunderbolt had done its job. The accounting of that job is measured in tonnage destroyed, sorties flown, and missions completed. But the human cost and human achievement matter more than statistics. Thousands of pilots flew combat missions in aircraft that started the war as pure fighters and ended it as multi-role platforms. They adapted their skills to changing requirements. They accepted dangerous missions because the war demanded it. Many didn't survive. Those who did carried the experience for the rest of their lives. The ground crews deserve equal recognition. Mechanics who worked through night to repair battle damage. Armourers who loaded bombs and ammunition in all weather. Crew chiefs who kept aircraft flyable despite parts shortages and impossible demands. Their names don't appear in histories, but their contribution was absolutely essential. Without them, the aircraft never leave the ground. The P-47's post-war service life was brief by modern standards. The jet age arrived quickly after 1945. Piston-engined fighters became obsolete within a few years. By the early 1950s, Thunderbolts were being retired from frontline American service, replaced by jets like the F-87 Shooting Star and F-87 Thunderjet. Some air forces operated P-47s into the 1950s, but they were anachronisms by then, relics of a war that had ended and a technology that had been surpassed. The irony is that when the Korean War started in 1950, the Air Force had hundreds of P-47s in storage but chose not to use them. The F-51 Mustang returned to combat service. The F-82 twin Mustang flew ground attack missions. But the P-47, superior in both payload capacity and survivability, sat in desert boneyards. To this day, nobody has adequately explained that decision. When ground attack capability was desperately needed, the aircraft best suited for the mission remained unused. Perhaps the answer lies in institutional momentum. The Mustang had captured public imagination as the premier American fighter. The P-47, for all its accomplishments, never achieved the same popular recognition. It was too big, too heavy, too ugly to inspire the romantic imagery that surrounded sleeker aircraft. So when commanders needed fighter bombers for Korea, they turned to the famous Mustang rather than the more capable but less celebrated Thunderbolt. This tendency to favor the famous over the effective is a recurring pattern in military history. Perception shapes decisions as much as performance data. The P-47's lack of aesthetic appeal, the reason pilots called it the Jug, may have undermined its reputation despite overwhelming evidence of combat effectiveness. It's a reminder that even in warfare, where results should matter most, human psychology and institutional culture influence outcomes. The ultimate legacy of the P-47 isn't found in museums or histories, it's found in the evolution of fighter design philosophy. Modern multi-role fighters descend conceptually from World War II aircraft that proved a single airframe could perform multiple missions effectively. The F-15E Strike Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-18 Hornet, all these aircraft embody the principle that fighters can also bomb, that air superiority platforms can also provide close air support. That principle wasn't obvious in 1941. It became doctrine by 1945 because aircraft like the P-47 demonstrated its validity in combat. The institutional learning that allowed the Thunderbolt's transformation from interceptor to fighter bomber established patterns that shaped Air Force procurement and doctrine for decades afterward. Innovation doesn't always announce itself with revolutionary breakthroughs. Sometimes it arrives through incremental adaptation that accumulates into fundamental change. The engineers who designed the underwing pylons contributed to that change. The pilots who flew ground attack missions validated it. The mechanics who installed modifications enabled it. The commanders who authorized adaptation facilitated it. None of them individually changed the course of the war. Collectively, their contributions altered how air forces understood their own capabilities and shaped how future aircraft would be designed, equipped, and employed. This is how technological and tactical evolution actually happens in successful militaries. Not through lone geniuses defying institutions, but through institutions that remain flexible enough to recognize when circumstances demand adaptation. The P-47's story is less dramatic than tales of maverick innovators, but it's more representative of how military adaptation succeeds when it works properly. The Thunderbolt that attacked ground targets over Normandy in June 1944 was the same aircraft that had flown bomber escort missions over Germany in 1943. Same basic airframe, same engine, same guns, but with modifications that enabled different mission profiles and tactics that exploited those modifications effectively. The transformation happened because multiple groups, engineers, pilots, commanders, maintenance crews recognized necessity and responded professionally. That professionalism won wars, not the glamorous heroism celebrated in popular culture, but the mundane competence of people doing difficult jobs under impossible circumstances and finding ways to do them better. The mechanic who spent 200 hours installing underwing racks contributed as much to victory as the pilot who flew the combat mission. Both deserve recognition, both matter. The final image worth considering. A P-47 returning to base after a ground attack mission, riddled with flak holes, one engine cylinder blown away, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines, pilot nursing the crippled aircraft home through force of will and skill. The aircraft lands. The crew chief surveys the damage. Repairs begin immediately because another mission launches in hours. This cycle repeated thousands of times across every theatre of the war. Aircraft got hit, crews repaired them, pilots flew them again. The determination to keep fighting despite casualties, damage, and exhaustion eventually overwhelmed enemies who lacked similar resilience. Material superiority mattered, but the will to use that material effectively mattered more. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied both. Superior design, rugged construction, powerful armament, these were material advantages. But the aircraft succeeded because the men who flew and maintained it refused to accept limitations. When the mission changed, they adapted. When modifications were needed, they implemented them. When tactics required refinement, they refined them. The combination of technological capability and human determination made the Thunderbolt one of the war's most effective aircraft. That effectiveness came at tremendous cost. 3,499 P-47s lost to enemy action. Thousands of pilots killed or captured. Countless close calls where luck or skill or both barely saved lives. The statistics represent human tragedy on a massive scale. But that tragedy purchased victory. The ground attacks that broke German logistics, the close air support that enabled Allied advances, the interdiction missions that isolated enemy forces, all these contributions accumulated into strategic success. The men who paid that price deserve remembrance not just for their sacrifice but for their competence. They were professionals who adapted to changing requirements, accepted dangerous missions, and executed them effectively despite terrible odds. Some became aces and received recognition. Most flew their missions, survived or didn't, and returned to obscurity after the war. All contributed to victory. The P-47 story, stripped of romance and mythology, is fundamentally about institutional adaptation and professional competence. An aircraft designed for one mission proved capable of others when circumstances demanded flexibility. The system engineering, procurement, training, tactical development adapted to enable that flexibility. The result was an aircraft that helped win the war not through revolutionary innovation, but through steady, effective execution of evolving missions. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. The difference between impossible and done isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just determined people solving problems, implementing solutions, and doing the work that needs doing. The P-47 Thunderbolt, and the men who flew it did that work. They adapted, they fought, they won. Not bad for an aircraft that started life as a pure interceptor and ended it as one of history's most effective fighter bombers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.